how did that happen? 20,000 miles on a Triumph rocket in 1 year. Well, it helps if you're retired. But before we get into that, I think I need to give you a little bit of an outline as to how I ended up doing all this motorcycling solo. Rachel wanted to wait another 10 years to celebrate our big wedding anniversary, but I insisted that we celebrated our 40th, which was in November 2019. It turned out to be one of my better decisions. She died unexpectedly 8 months later. Our first grandchild was born 5 weeks after she died. She was so looking forward to meeting him, but obviously it didn't happen. Our second grandchild was born in March last year, 2 days before I started chemotherapy. Yes, now it was my turn to get cancer. This is a story of that time between Rachel's death and me getting cancer, which actually was the end of 2022. We both retired in 2012, bought a motorhome and travelled across Europe. 3 months away, 3 months at home, and alternated for 8 years. We saw motorbikes, plenty of motorbikes. Rachel and I both had motorbikes from the ages of 17. But there was one motorbike that actually was more than all the others put together. And you've probably guessed it, the BMW GS. Fortunately, my local BMW dealer is just 1 mile away. So after Rachel died in July 2020, I sold the motorhome. But what did I want to do with my life? That, in fact, is a completely different story. But anyway, I decided to return to motorcycling. I think I still wanted to travel, but I hadn't travelled solo, well, not since I was 17. Anyway, despite having not ridden a motorbike for 10 years, I had no qualms about taking a GS out for a couple of hours. I set off from the dealership, and within 100 metres, it was like I'd never been away. The bike was just so easy to ride. I loved it, so much so that actually I went out and bought one. Over the next year, I didn't leave these islands. I just stayed on the UK and covered 13,000 miles, which I don't think was too shabby. But towards the end of the year, I had this hankering for a classic British bike. I had a Triumph Trident when I was about 20, I think. And I had this longing, like I say, for maybe a modern classic. So I ended up buying a Triumph Bonneville T120, not to replace the BMW, because that was the main bike, but the Triumph T120 was to kind of fill a void in my motorcycling life. I loved it. The pea-shooter exhaust sound just took me back to a bygone era. Of course, the heated handlebar grips, the smooth engine and no oil leaks reminded me that in fact I was riding a modern classic. Anyway, I'd only had the bike for a couple of 3 weeks, took it back to the dealer in Blackburn for its first service. And whilst I was there was a Triumph Rocket test bike. So obviously I asked if I could ride one. Well, I could, but it came with a warning. And the warning was, if you ride it, you'll want one. Well, that wasn't going to happen because I was off to Spain in 3 weeks on the GS. Anyway, sat aboard the bike, fired it up, and it gave me a feeling like I've never had since I was 18. A feeling of awe, a feeling of being a little bit intimidated by the bike. That huge engine was a little bit scary. The bike I had when I was 18 that did that to me was a Z1. Anyway, I set off on the Rocket, loved it. Loved the engine, loved the low revs, the exhaust note, the overrun. It was so comfortable. It was great. Brought it back, said, yeah, lovely bike, but I'm off to Spain in 3 weeks, so maybe another time. Within those 3 weeks, I sold the BMW, bought a Rocket 3 GT, put 700 miles on it, returned to the dealership en route to the ferry so it could have its first service. And from there, I went to Spain. Trip number 1, August 2021. The ferry to Bilbao, where after visiting a castle nearby, I headed to the Picos Mountains, and from the Picos, a few days there, and in Asturias, I continued west into Galicia, and then travelled south through Portugal, visiting Porto and Coimbra, and eventually down to Lisbon, across to Spain into Andalusia, and then from Andalusia, where I spent, a good week, I continued up the coast, Valencia, Cordoba, and then back up through Spain and up through France. It was 6 weeks away. I did 6,000 miles. Trip 2, that was again going back to Spain. This was in March 2022. Got the ferry to Santander, and this time did something a little different. Spent 2 days riding down through Spain until I got to a place called Huelva in the south. From there, I jumped on another ferry, about 30 hours, to the Canary Islands. Around Tenerife, I had a week in Los Cristianos. And after a week there, I jumped on the ferry to La Gomera. I had a week on La Gomera, which is a brilliant island. That time of year, quite a change in temperature, because you have to go up into the mountains to go back down to the next resort or place. Not that there's many resorts, it's not like other Canary Islands. There's some beautiful roads on it, it's a lot quieter. And I contemplated kind of staying there for a little bit longer, but eventually decided to return to Tenerife. When I arrived in Los Cristianos again, I headed over to the north side of the island and stayed for 10 days in Puerto de la Cruz. From there, I think I must have covered just about every road on the island. I really feel as though I know Tenerife now. I returned via the same route, ferry back to Huelva, ride back up to Santander, ferry back home. A total of 4,500 miles over a period of about 4 or 5 weeks. Trip number 3. This was a complete contrast. Living in the north of England, I travelled down on my bike to Suffolk, where we had a big family get-together. And I thought, well, if I'm going to Suffolk, I may as well carry on to Scandinavia. I mean, it's just a case of jumping on the ferry at Harwich over to the Hook of Holland. I ride across Holland, Germany, into Denmark, stayed over in Hamburg, which somebody had actually met on La Gomera, and then I had a night in Copenhagen. And from there, that's when I set off at 6:30 in the morning, with my intention of getting north of Stockholm. That was 400 miles away. The roads were great, quiet, until you got to the vicinity of the capital, and then obviously, like any capital, it gets a bit crazy. I wanted to get well north of Stockholm. Obviously, that time of year, the daylight's excellent. This was the whole purpose of the trip. So I actually ended up doing another 200 miles. So that was a total of 600 miles that day. Found a nice hotel, stayed there the one night, and I was kind of winging it with hotels. And then the next day I rode about 400 miles to a place called Storfossen. And I stumbled across this hotel by complete accident, but it was a brilliant hotel and made an excellent base for what I was planning to do. So it's 60 miles south of the Arctic Circle. So my plan was to leave the hotel as late as possible and then just to keep riding until I decided not to. So left the room at 11 o'clock, got on the road about 11:30. It was very hot. It was hot all over Europe at that time, as you may well remember. Anyway, it was 28 degrees when I set off. Quick photo as I crossed the polar circle, and then just continued riding. Again, the road's absolutely brilliant. Well, most of the time. You'll see a couple of clips where maybe they weren't quite so good. But anyway, yeah, just kept going. Into Finland, and then into Norway. And I carried on until I couldn't go any further, which was the North Cape. I arrived there at 3 o'clock the next morning. It was cold, a very cold wind, but it was still sunny. I'd been riding in the sunshine pretty much all the time, which is what my goal was. So after the obligatory photograph, I layered up and then returned to Alta, which is about 150 miles back down the same road, and then headed west. My intention was to eventually get to the Lofoten Islands, where I had been before with Rachel in the motorhome. Anyway, by 1:30 in the afternoon, I'd been on the road for 26 hours. I was getting a little bit tired, I think. So I found a hotel, and yeah, that was it. Just over 800 miles in 26 hours. In sunshine pretty much all the time. And that was a very, very special experience. Anyway, from there, I decided to slow down a little bit. Headed across to a couple of islands, Sommeroy, Senja, and eventually ended on the Lofoten Islands, which anybody who's been there, it's just magical. I had a few days on the Lofoten Islands, jumped on the ferry back to mainland Norway, and continued down the west coast. When I got back down to the Arctic Circle, sounds a bit weird that, there was a Dutch guy on, yes, you guessed it, a BMW GS. Anyway, we got chatting. He asked what my route back was. And so anyway, I said I'm going down the west coast, and the weather was grim. And he said he was going to go via Sweden. And then I think he had second thoughts. It's the first time he'd ever ridden abroad on his own. I think he wanted a fellow companion. So anyway, we ended up tagging along with each other for 6 days. He showed me some roads that I didn't know of, which was great, and vice versa. Now it's unusual because I've been in Norway now for about 3 weeks. Well, Sweden and Norway, and the speed limits are ridiculously low. The only thing I would say is that apparently most of the speed detection is done with forward-facing cameras, so motorcyclists kind of get a little bit of a free hit, but with the penalties being ridiculously high, like minimum penalty for going just a few miles an hour over the speed limit, you're looking at, I think, 700 euros or equivalent to 700 pounds. And then the next fine after that is actually prison. So I was a bit cautious. Never got caught for speeding, which was great. But when we got off the ferry, there were about 50 bikes going on the ferry between Norway and Denmark. When we got off the ferry at Denmark, it was like wacky races. Now, bearing in mind I'd barely ridden over 60 miles an hour for the time I'd been in Scandinavia. 80 miles an hour felt fast, but then you soon get used to it. Anyway, that whole trip, I went back, stayed a night in Germany, then got the ferry back to Newcastle from IJmuiden. That whole trip, which was 3.5 weeks, was 6,000 miles. It's strange being up here at 11:30 at night, staying for a few hours. But yeah, that has to be done. Trip number 4 was actually just over 2 weeks after trip number 3, but it was a complete contrast. This was with my 2 mates, Ray and Ken, both on cruiser bikes, Harley Davidson and an R18 BMW. We got the ferry from Newcastle to IJmuiden, and then this trip was all about seeing the Western Front Way, the British sector. So it was a couple of nights in Bruges, a couple of nights in Ghent, and a couple of nights in Arras in France. And we visited a lot of the well-known sites. It was just brilliant. We did 700 miles in a week. I mean, I did more than that in one day, or in 26 hours when I was in Scandinavia. But what a refreshing change it was. It went so well that we agreed that in 2023 I'd take them to the Picos Mountains. Of course, a small matter of cancer got in the way. So we changed the ferry crossing, and we're going to do it in July this year, hopefully. I'm feeling a lot better now, although not completely recovered. So Ray and Ken jumped on the ferry after the 7 days. Ray and Ken jumped on the ferry, headed back to Newcastle, and I headed west across France. Saw relations in St Malo. Then from there got the ferry, did Jersey and Guernsey, and then home. Total mileage for that trip was about, let me see, 2,500. That was about it, really. So all in all, that takes me up to about 20,000 miles when you add in what I was doing at home. That trip to the Western Front Way turned out to be my last big trip on the Rocket. If you've managed to stick this video out to the end, then thank you and well done. You deserve a medal. The Rocket will be going back on the road. I will be resuming my travels later this year. So thank you very much for watching.